Hey squad, welcome back to my series imagining different forms of magic in Middle-earth. Today I'm going to take a look at necromancy, the grim and often corrupt ways in which beings may be contacted or even coerced after their deaths. For the purpose of this series, I am defining magic as any manipulation of reality or perception by any created being from the Valar down to hobbits that appears to be achieved in a way that modern humans would deem supernatural. I will also be assuming that the magic in these fantasy stories follows some kind of logical principles, even though I recognize that showcasing a rigorously detailed hard magic system was not one of Tolkien's aims for his created universe. At first glance, it may not seem like necromancy is much practiced in Middle-earth. There are plenty of dark, creepy, and even horrifying elements in this world, but most of these are part of the realm of the living. There are references to vampires and werewolves, but while these creatures have historically been associated with life after death, Tolkien doesn't seem to be relying on the current pop culture versions of these beasts codified by horror films. There are apparitions of the dead, such as the faces in the Dead Marshes, but that doesn't necessarily prove that the dead themselves are lingering, or even if they are, that they can be manipulated by supernatural means. On the other hand, it's hard to explain incidents such as the hobbits' run-in with the Barrow-wights and Aragorn's army of dead Oathbreakers without positing the existence of some kind of magic specific to dealing with the souls of the not-so-departed. Sauron himself is described both in the Lay of Leithian and in The Hobbit as a necromancer. There are also isolated incidents and references scattered throughout the Legendarium which strongly suggest necromancy, particularly when combined with some of Tolkien's more experimental musings from History of Middle-earth. Necromancy translates to divination by means of the dead, but the word is often understood to encompass any kind of communication with or control over dead spirits. Physical reanimation of the dead, seen in things like revenants or zombies, is a closely related concept. Since by its nature it closely concerns death and decay, necromancy has a reputation for being a somber, dark, and creepy practice. But while frequently spooky, it's not always considered evil as such. Communicating with the spirits of dead ancestors is one of the oldest and most widespread magical or spiritual practices in human history. Even today, seeing an apparition or being visited by a departed loved one in a vision or dream are not generally viewed as sinister or corrupt. It's the practice of intentionally compelling contact with the dead that is usually portrayed as wrong or dangerous. This distinction carries over into Middle-earth. On the one hand, Tolkien usually expresses the view that in and of themselves, magical practices, like any skills or abilities, are fundamentally morally neutral. However, certain techniques more readily lend themselves to acts of compulsion and domination, so they are more likely to be used for evil motives. Necromancy, by definition, has to involve death, which means we also need to define what death is, and in Arda, this isn't as stupid a question as it sounds. Death means different things to different people. The Ainur can take on physical forms, and those forms can be defeated or even apparently outright slain, but in general, disembodied Ainur can't really be said to be dead since their physical forms are semblances only, and their natural state is as immaterial spirits. There do seem to be a handful of exceptions to this, for example the Astari or Morgoth himself, but this is only seen in cases where the person in question has approximated a truly incarnate state. That leaves us with the naturally incarnate races of Arda, the so-called Children of Eru, dwarves, men, and elves. We know very little about dwarven metaphysics, and even less about their own traditions around the supernatural. But what we do know suggests that dwarves are probably mostly immune from the kinds of necromancy we'll be examining today. Dwarves hit the sweet spot between human mortality and elvish longevity. They live long but finite lives, and upon their deaths are said to reside in a special hall in Mandos. The dwarves believe that their part shall be to serve Aule and to aid him in the remaking of Arda after the last battle. It's also believed that at times the kings of the dwarves are reborn in their descendants. This means that dwarven souls, like the souls of elves, are perfectly content within Arda and don't suffer the pangs of weariness or restlessness that mortal souls are subject to. However, they also don't have to worry about the consequences of long embodiment, like the elves do. Moreover, dwarves are notoriously difficult to control. Aule made them from their beginning of a kind to resist most steadfastly any domination. Though they could be slain or broken, they could not be reduced to shadows enslaved to another will. Even Sauron, with the help of his full complement of rings, is unable to directly affect them very much. And as we'll see, this means that you can't really do necromancy on dwarves either. This leaves us with men and elves, who, unlike any other creature within Arda, are a direct emanation of the thought of Eru himself. The peculiar relationship of what the elves call the Fea, or indwelling spirit, to the Hroa, or bodily form, appears to be a result of Eru's own design, and this means even the Valar aren't always sure how it works, and are hesitant to interfere with it. Moreover, according to the account in the Silmarillion, certain aspects of this relationship were modified by Eru after Arda's history was underway. He announces the gift of death to men after an age of silent contemplation following the Valar's departure. So while we have a pretty good understanding of how life and death usually work for men and even more so for elves, we also have in-universe reasons to anticipate deviations, exceptions, and perversions of the natural course. Though their experience of death is very different from the Mannish one, the elves are the best place to start because we have plenty of details about their afterlives. After reaching maturity, the rate at which elves age physically is so slow as to be barely perceptible, and if left to their own devices, their souls do not forsake their bodies like the souls of men do. Elvish Faer have greater control over and sympathy with their Hroar, and this partly explains why it's so difficult to slay an elf, whether by violence or by environmental factors like extreme cold or lack of food. If an elven body is so ruined as to be non-functional, the soul must forsake it, but a weakened or wounded elf with any hope of recovery will not die involuntarily, on accident, like a man might. What happens instead is that the Fea voluntarily departs the body when its experiences become too painful for it to bear. This pain can be physical or emotional. Elves can and do decide to abandon their bodies when overpowered by grief or despair. Feanor's mother Miriel is a prime example of this. Elven death is not to be confused with the physical fading they undergo in Middle-earth as the ages wear on. Tolkien is quite clear that the Fea of a faded elf is still united with its Hroa. It's just that said Hroa has basically become immaterial. The body becomes at last, as it were, a mere memory held by the Fea, so that the elves are indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed. Their bodily forms may no longer be seen by us mortals, or seen only dimly and fitfully. The benefit is that the elf no longer has to worry about losing its physical body to violence, or about damage and corruption to said body negatively affecting its soul. But the downside is the ability to directly participate in Arda becomes drastically limited. Elven Faer that do forsake their bodies remain within Arda, and while men might envy this so-called ability to remain within the world even in absence of a body, it's not a very pleasant experience for the soul in question. Such Faer are called naked or houseless. While invisible to bodily eyes, they can be perceived by Ainur elves and others with spiritual acumen. It's a deeply unnatural state for an elf to be in, and addressing this problem is one of the Valar's main delegated tasks after they complete their early shaping of Arda. The Vala Mandos issues a summons that, if accepted, draws the Houseless Fea into his halls, which are neither elf heaven nor an elven underworld, but a real location in Valinor, very much within Arda. Supposedly, no one who enters the halls of Mandos can leave without permission, not even Morgoth. Living visitors are not allowed, and as for the prospect of reuniting with all your dead loved ones, well, it's not as exciting as it sounds when you're all unhoused spirits consumed with longing for your physical bodies, and largely fixed in the same psychological condition you were in when you died. The Fea in its nakedness is obdurate, and remains long in the bondage of its memory and old purposes. There is in the halls of waiting little mingling or communing of kind with kind, or indeed of any one Fea with another, for the Houseless Fea is solitary by nature, and turns only toward those with whom maybe it formed strong bonds of love and life. It's only with the consent and aid of the Valar that elves can regain bodies and resume living in their natural state. At first, Tolkien suggested that elven souls were allowed to be literally reborn as babies, but later he developed a different idea, that with the help of the Valar, the soul would reconstruct its body according to its memory of the old one. Either way, the Valar only tend to grant this permission if the soul in question is sane and healthy, which means that most elves who have managed to meet a violent death are looking at a long waiting period, either because of the psychic trauma of their deaths or their own corrupt deeds. So while accepting the summons of Mondos is pretty much the only legitimate way to achieve reincarnation, it's still a daunting prospect for most, and some elves choose to refuse the call, particularly those who, at the least, have refused the door of life and remain in regret and self-pity, and those among the Eldar who were darkened in spirit, who did unnatural deeds and were capable of hatred and malice. There are two distinctly creepy options at this point. The soul in question can linger in Middle-earth as the equivalent of what men might call a ghost. Such houseless spirits are dangerous. Driven by their need for a body, they may seek to eject the Fea of the living from its body, and in the contest for mastery, the body may be gravely injured. But as it turns out, Mondos isn't the only Vala interested in gathering the souls of dead elves. Morgoth also issues a summons, and plenty of confused or spiteful souls answer his call instead. Even of the Eldar, some who had become corrupted refused the summons, and then had little power to resist the counter-summons of Morgoth. Some were enslaved by the Dark Lord and do his work still, though he himself is gone. Now, as I mentioned, Ainur and Elves can perceive and communicate with the Houseless, and as this is an innate ability, it doesn't qualify as magic per se. The issuing of the summons comes closer to true necromancy, as it seems to be a conscious act that requires a particular skill or technique, and moreover depends on the subject being dead. While the Valar are strictly forbidden from meddling with free will, they do possess the ability to exert an influence over the emotions of lesser minds that, for practical purposes, can become nearly irresistible. They could dominate the minds of other creatures, including elves and men, by force, fear, or deceits, or sheer magnificence. For the living, the ability to perceive such impressions from other minds is dimmed by the Hroa. When the Faer are houseless, however, they are open to the direct instruction and command of the Valar. The necromancer himself, ironically, provides an example of the kind of vulnerability being stripped from one's body entails. During his fight with Luthien and Huan, despite being at the height of his shapeshifting powers, Sauron is eventually pinned down, and Luthien threatens him to get the passwords to his fortress. Ere his foul spirit left its dark house, Luthien came to him and said that he should be stripped of his raiment of flesh, and his ghost be sent quaking back to Morgoth, and she said, "There everlastingly thy naked self shall endure the torment of his scorn, pierced by his eyes, unless thou yield to me the tower." Now, Sauron is one of the Ainur, but even at this point in his life he's already been a very naughty boy, and like his master and fellow Umayar, his dependence on his physical form is increasing. So even though Sauron knows full well that being killed will not do him much damage in the long run, Luthien's threat is still a potent one. Being sent back naked to endure the force of his master's scorn without the protection of his physical form is apparently an even worse prospect than handing over his hard-won island fortress to the enemy. So making a point of exerting pressure specifically on the houseless souls of slain elves meant that a nearly complete control could be exerted over them. Moreover, since naked Faer are slow to change, this control would be fairly permanent. Living elves and even men and orcs can be dominated and essentially controlled by the will of Morgoth or Sauron, but when that will is withdrawn, they will start to pursue their own interests. But a bodiless Fea, fixed in wicked purposes or overwhelmed by grief and terror, will tend to remain in that state. While random, unaligned houseless souls might feign allegiance to an ambitious would-be human sorcerer in order to gain their trust, it seems that Sauron is able to give his pupils actual control over such spirits, either through teaching them some actual technique to control these spirits themselves, or by creating the illusion of such control by simply ordering the spirits to do whatever the silly mortal asks. To attempt to master them and to make them servants of one's own will is wickedness. Such practices are of Morgoth, and the necromancers are of the host of Sauron, his servant. Based on all this, I think it's clear that the supposed immortality of the elves and persistence of their souls within Arda after death has some real disadvantages when pitted against necromancy. So let's turn to the mortal men who actually tend to fare a bit better. Mannish death contains an extra wrinkle of complexity because, unlike the elves, men have suffered some kind of general darkening, which changed their relationship with death. The examples of the early kings of Numenor and such heroic characters as Aragorn suggest that at one time men had the ability to die voluntarily, similarly to the elves. They would depart their bodies at the end of their lives as the weariness of age approached. However, most men tend to cling to life until their decaying bodies can no longer support union with their souls, at which point they are ejected. The official version of what happens next is that Mannish souls too are summoned to Mandos, though unlike the Elves, they lack the ability to refuse. After being processed in a separate part of the halls, they depart Arda entirely for parts unknown. However, there are some pretty clear counterexamples to this narrative. One of the biggest is Aragorn's encounter with what Legolas describes as the Shades of Men when he takes the paths of the dead. In a possible example of good necromancy, Aragorn is able to enlist the aid of these shades by offering them a way to fulfill an oath they took to Aragorn's ancestor Isildur. Originally, the men of Dunharrow had sworn to support Isildur against Sauron, but later went back on their word. In response, Isildur cursed them to rest never until their oath was fulfilled. So, whether it was an inherent result of breaking their solemn vow or due to Isildur's curse, the terms that bind the men of Dunharrow have already been put in place. Aragorn's communicating with, and even commanding, the souls of long-dead men, which falls pretty clearly under the necromancy umbrella. But the conditions that allow him to do this were created while the men in question were still alive. A similar example is Gorlim's appearance to Beren in the First Age. Gorlim is one of the 10 companions of Beren's father Barahir. Sauron lures him into his clutches using a phantom of his wife, and promises to reunite Gorlim with his beloved if he betrays the location of his companions. Gorlim does so, at which point Sauron delightedly informs Gorlim that his wife is dead, and so to make good on his promise to reunite them, he'll just kill Gorlim as well. After Gorlim's death, Beren has a dream in which Gorlim appears to tell Beren what he's done and warn him of the incipient orc attack on his father. It seems that the apparition of Gorlim's dead wife is a deceit of Sauron's, nothing more than a cruel illusion and not really the presence of the dead woman. While it's easy to see how this might be confused with real necromancy, it's not. However, it seems that Gorlim's spirit really is able to stay in Middle-earth and dodge the summons of Mandos long enough to pass on his warning to Beren. Unlike Valar and Elves, men are not generally able to sense disembodied souls, but when asleep, men are more open to the impressions sent by other minds. Beren doesn't summon or bind Gorlim in any way. Instead, Gorlim seems to be the one choosing to linger and appear to his former comrade. This could mean that Mannish souls have more say over when and how they report to the halls of Mandos than commonly believed. But on the other hand, just like the armies of the dead, Gorlim is most likely bound by an oath, one of fealty to his liege Barahir. In fact, going a step further, by the time Beren wakes up and races back to his father's camp, Barahir is already dead, which would make Beren the new Lord of Dor-lómin. It's unclear at what point in the night he would have come into this macabre inheritance, but the timing makes me wonder if Gorlim was only able to appear to Beren once Barahir was dead. In other words, maybe the only action Gorlim is able or allowed to take is to fulfill the terms of his violated oath, whoever its holder might currently be. Perhaps, just like the dead men of Dunharrow, it was even necessary that he offer this final service before he could move on. These examples of post-mortem activity being dependent on circumstances established during life raise the specter, pun intended, of the possibility of human immortality. Breaking an oath, for instance, seems to result in a human's ability to remain in Arda, and even take action within it after death, albeit under narrow and unenviable conditions. Are there other, better techniques for binding a mortal soul within Middle-earth? In the extended version of the Tale of the Children of Húrin found in Unfinished Tales, Morgoth curses Húrin atop Thangorodrim so that he could not move from that place, nor die until Morgoth should release him. If Morgoth can extend this ability to trap souls within bodies to elves, it would help explain why he's able to capture and even torture thralls without more of them simply opting to abandon their bodies. Morgoth was originally a Vala, and the Valar do seem to have unique powers in questions of embodiment. It's only the Valar that can legitimately re-embody elven souls at their discretion, for example, and Eru gives them the authority to deal with the question of half-elven mortality, suggesting they already had the power to meddle with such affairs and were only waiting on permission. Lesser beings, even ones so great as Sauron, seem to face more complications. One thing that would definitely have to be addressed is the physical decay of mortal bodies as they age. But as we know, there's a place where material reality is not subject to the corruption of Morgoth, the Undying Lands, where men are largely forbidden from setting foot. Some, like the Númenóreans, came to believe that this ban was meant to deny men the immortality enjoyed by the elves. Others maintain that the gift of death is innate to men, which suggests that living in Valinor would not change anything. The truth seems more complicated. Tolkien explored in some detail what a human in Valinor might likely experience. The man would grow very quickly, but not physically decline. The soul would grow weary of life, while the body remained at the peak of its abilities and enjoyment. Very soon then, the Fea and Hroa of Aman and Aman would not be united and at peace, and would be opposed to the great pain of both. There are two outcomes for such a man. If the body gained control over the soul, he would become more like a beast, though one tormented within. The other option is that the soul would grow so disgusted by its continued life that it would either forcefully tear itself from its body in a violent and painful death, or else it would in loathing and without pity desert the Hroa, and it would live on a witless body, not even a beast, but a monster. This remains a mostly hypothetical consideration. However, this effect seems to have been leveraged in a particularly horrifying instance of borderline necromancy, the case of Ar-Pharazôn and his invading army. According to the Silmarillion, Ar-Pharazôn and his Númenórean host are finally persuaded by Sauron to sail to Aman, breaking the ban of the Valar, and going up with war against the Deathless to wrest from them everlasting life within the circles of the world. Their fleet lands on the coasts of Valinor itself, and the host camps around the city of Tuna. The Valar appeal directly to Eru, who changes the shape of the world and drowns the Númenórean ships, along with the island of Númenor itself. But Ar-Pharazôn the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten until the last battle and the day of doom. Now this could just be a rumor or legend, but if it's not, then in theory Ar-Pharazôn and his men have suffered a deliciously ironic punishment. Seeking immortality, they've become imprisoned in more ways than one by the undying lands themselves. Their souls will grow ever wearier while their bodies remain undecayed. It seems likely that they would all eventually be reduced to the state of beasts tormented from within, and were any of them to succeed in severing the bond between Fea and Hroa, the result would be a body that's living but devoid of soul, the very work of Melkor in the midst of Aman, which the Valar themselves would fain destroy. Middle-earth's closest thing to a zombie. Appalling though this is, it's less a magical technique and more the logical result of the nature of Valinor, the destiny of men, and, at least in this case, the divine intervention of Ilúvatar himself. But it provides an illuminating contrast with phenomena that are more obviously magical. A big one here is the effects of the Rings of Power, particularly on human bearers. Now, whether or not this is necromancy is another example of a tricky decision. In this case, I tend to fall on the side of no, because the Ringwraiths don't die. They do still have bodies. That's how the rings work. They preserve whatever is beloved, including the physical life of their bearers. But in the case of the Nazgul, their bodies have become largely imperceptible to bodily eyes. It's almost as if the wraiths have undergone an accelerated fading process, similar to that which the elves undergo. The difference is neither Fea nor Hroa is designed to do so. The use of the rings, though, is not the only way to initiate such a process. There are also Morgul weapons, such as the knife that wounds Frodo at Weathertop. As a shard of the knife works its way toward his heart, in addition to pain, numbness, and cold, Frodo begins to perceive more of the unseen than the seen. The mist before his eyes had darkened, and he felt that a shadow was coming between him and the faces of his friends. During the day, things about him faded to shadows of ghostly gray. He almost welcomed the coming of night, for then the world seemed less pale and empty. Gandalf later tells Frodo, "They tried to pierce your heart with a Morgul knife which remains in the wound. If they had succeeded, you would have become like they are, only weaker and under their command. You would have become a wraith under the dominion of the Dark Lord." Buried in the appendices is a note about another mortal wounded by such a blade, Steward Boromir I. Boromir lives another 12 years after the incident, which suggests that a shard did not remain behind in his body. Gandalf seems to think that Frodo's 14 days was a remarkably long time for anyone, even a strong warrior of men, to survive. Nevertheless, Boromir becomes shrunken with pain, and his life is shortened. After the shard is removed from Frodo's wound, even after the power of the rings, and the Ringwraiths, has been destroyed, he still experiences pain and chills every year on the anniversary of his injury. And also, for a while, his eyes appeared not to see things about him. He endures only 2 such anniversaries before his departure for Valinor. It seems that Morgul weapons initiate a process similar to what the human wearers of Rings of Power undergo, the diminishment of the body's ability to participate in material reality, in exchange for the strengthening of the bond between the Fea and the Hroa such that the soul is not forced out by the body's physical decay. This process is described as fading, and seems to be very similar in some respects to the fading of the Elves. One difference is that for elves, death or unhousing leaves them particularly vulnerable to the predations of stronger spirits, whereas fading seems to preserve them. For men, dying frees them from most of the constraints within Arda, but fading into wraiths, at least through the mechanisms of rings and Morgul blades, exposes them to control from other spirits in a visceral, immediate way. Sauron obviously holds dominion over the Ringwraiths, though it is unclear how much of a role the rings themselves play in this, and in turn, the wraiths have control over those who succumb to Morgul wounds. Based on the experiences of Frodo and Boromir I, it looks like such wraithification can progress, even if the wound is superficial and no shards remain. This would explain, for instance, why Frodo cannot find healing in Middle-earth, just like the elves who must retire to the unstained realm of Valinor to avoid fading. In Frodo's case, the experience doesn't seem to be a particularly enjoyable one, but it's unlikely he would become enslaved even if the Morgul wound continued its work, since the Ringwraiths and their master are no longer around. In the case of Boromir I, though, enslavement upon death remains a possibility. Gandalf says that the Wraith's control of Frodo would have been complete if the shard had pierced his heart, which could mean that it's somehow necessary for the blade to physically touch the heart for the enchantment to work, but it could also just be that having anything pierce your heart tends to be fatal, and so maybe dying while the wraithification process was underway would have fixed Frodo permanently in a faded state. So to my mind, it's entirely possible that at the moment of Boromir I's untimely death from ostensibly natural causes, he could have become a thrall of the Nazgul. This idea is further supported by what we know of the Witch King's power throughout the Third Age. While his master Sauron continues to gain strength, the Witch King founds the Kingdom of Angmar in the north, populating it with many evil men and orcs and other fell creatures. From their capital of Carndum, these Nazis wage war on the fractured realms of Arnor, ravaging Cardolan in 1409. Later, in 1636, after a plague destroys the last remnants of Cardolan, at the bidding of the Witch King, evil spirits out of Angmar and Rhudaur entered into the deserted mounds and dwelt there, and it is presumed that this is when the Barrow Downs, previously the revered gravesites of ancient kings, become haunted by the mysterious creatures called Barrow-wights. There are many theories about the origins of these evil spirits. Some could be fallen Ainur in varying states of diminishment, now assisting in the ruin of the north at the bidding of Morgoth's lieutenant. Others could be houseless elves necromantically bound in perpetual service to Sauron or to the Witch King himself. But I think at least some of them, including the one the hobbits encounter in 3018, might be men who suffered Morgul wounds at the hands of Angmar's armies. Centuries after the Wights occupy the Barrows, our intrepid quartet of hobbits runs afoul of one of these creatures, described as a tall, dark figure like a shadow against the stars, with 2 eyes, very cold though lit with a pale light that seemed to come from some remote distance. This description is very similar to the later appearance of the Witch King in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. A shape, black-mantled, huge and threatening. A crown of steel he wore, but between rim and robe naught was there to see save only a deadly gleam of eyes. Most importantly, both the Nazgul and the Wights do seem to have physical bodies, attenuated almost to invisibility, but still capable of interacting with the physical world. Houseless elves do not. There are other telling similarities. The sudden appearance of a gray mist before the Wight strikes recalls the mist that Frodo feels descending on him as his Morgul wound worsens, or the gray, hazy world that Sam finds himself in when he puts the ring on in Mordor and is drawn into the unseen. Frodo's unconscious companions in the Barrow are cold, and one of the main symptoms of the Morgul blade is a sense of cold, while in both cases healing and recovery bring returned warmth. Even the voices of the Barrow-wights are similar to those of the Wraiths, wailing cries that rise and fall, in which words can be faintly distinguished. But to me, the most intriguing detail is what Merry says when he awakens from his white-induced slumber. Then he stopped, and a shadow came over his face, and he closed his eyes. "Of course, I remember," he said. "The men of Carndum came on us at night, and we were worsted. Ah, the spear in my heart!" He clutched at his breast. Tom Bombadil will later explain that the items in the Barrow belonged to the men of Westerness who had been overcome by the evil king of Carndum, and in the appendices it is noted that the particular Barrow in which the hobbits were imprisoned was thought to be the grave of the last king of Cardolan, slain during the 1409 invasion of Angmar. The interpretation that I find most likely, then, is that for a split second after awakening, Merry is sharing the memory of a man of Cardolan who was slain by a spear to his heart. Now, I found no evidence to suggest that knives are the only kind of Morgul weapon. In fact, when Faramir is wounded by an arrow, people fear that his continuing sickness means that he was hit from the shadows above by a dart of the Nazgul. Luckily for Faramir, he was only wounded by a regular Southron arrow, and so he's able to make a full recovery, but Merry's temporary companion may not have been so lucky. If struck through the heart by a Morgul spear, wielded by the Witch King or one of his powerful soldiers, he conceivably would have suffered the same fate that awaited Frodo before Elrond removed the shard he carried. He would have become something like a wraith himself, his body literally transfixed in the unseen realm at the moment of his death, his soul bound between life and death, enslaved to the Witch King's will, haunting his own king's tomb. What exactly this wight was doing with the hobbits is less clear. While in the mound, they are laid out as if for burial, ice-cold and covered with grave goods. The wight sings an incantation that seems designed to keep them sleeping on their stony subterranean beds indefinitely. At this point, an arm appears and starts reaching for the hilt of the sword that lies across their necks. Whatever it's planning to do with that sword is probably not gonna be pretty. From this evidence, it seems as if the hobbits are going to be bound in the barrow like the wight is, either trapped in suspended animation, something like Ar-Pharazôn and his army, or else slain and transformed into wraiths themselves. On the other hand, someone seems to have been briefly sharing Merry's body, leaving their memories behind, and this suggests possession rather than simple entrapment. Technically, it's not impossible that this mysterious possessor could have been an elf slain in battle. We know that elves from Rivendell and Lindon assisted Cardolan in the 1409 invasion. If this were the case, then maybe one could suppose the wraith-like wight, human in origin and retaining the vestiges of its body, is conducting a ritual at the command of an elven shade, similarly bound in the service of evil but likely of greater strength, who wants a body of his own and isn't too picky about how he gets it. On the other hand, it's specifically the men of Cardolan who were penned up in the Barrow Downs. The hobbits are trapped in a mannish tomb and bedecked with man-made jewelry and weapons. Furthermore, there's almost no reference in the text of The Lord of the Rings itself to elven shades. In the Third Age, the majority of relevant examples are human ones. This suggests that the possessor might have been human, and that even as a wraith bound to a vestigial body, this interloper was either planning to eject Merry's soul, or more likely exchange places with it, leaving Merry eternally bound in deathlike sleep in the faded, ghostly body of a wight, while the ancient soul of the man of Cardolan would walk again beneath the sun, in hobbit form. This all leaves us with a decent framework to evaluate cases of necromancy and seeming necromancy in Middle-earth. The conjuring of goetic phantoms is easily confused with necromancy, but doesn't actually involve the souls of the dead. While elves and Valar can directly detect disembodied souls as a matter of course, men cannot typically see more than shadowy forms, and neither, based on Gimli's experiences on the paths of the dead, can dwarves. However, souls both elven and in some circumstances human can communicate to men, often in dreams or visions. Unfinished business, such as an unfulfilled or outright broken vow, sometimes provides an avenue for the dead to converse with the living. Powerful spirits like the Ainur can influence or control other spirits through awe or terror. Where elves are concerned, this influence is partial while they remain united with their bodies, but upon death, their houseless bodies can be more readily ensnared. Ainur who become dependent on the use of a physical body, usually through repeated evil acts, eventually experience this as well. For men, the opposite effect is seen. In men, the Hroa is dominant, so they are more swayed by bodily concerns. After death, their Fear are no longer bound to Middle-earth and therefore no longer much influenced by even its more powerful inhabitants. This can be subverted, however, if the Fear remains bound to an increasingly immaterial Hroa. Such fading can be achieved through different methods, including the Rings of Power and Morgul weapons, and it makes men more vulnerable to attacks from the unseen. Either way, once a soul is rendered unnaturally vulnerable, it can be dominated or controlled by others. Powerful Ainur, yes, but also men who have been taught the arts of Sauron. Disembodied elves, even independent ones, will sometimes seek to possess the bodies of the living. From the example of the Barrow-wights, it seems possible that mortal souls can attempt something similar. Morgoth can apparently bind souls within their bodies to prevent death cheating him out of a particularly useful victim. Despite a lack of direct records, it is therefore plausible that a particularly skilled necromancer might be able to bind elven or even human souls into bodies, either the certified pre-owned bodies of the recently deceased, or purpose-built ones fresh off the assembly line. Tolkien has said that death is a main theme of his fiction, so it does make sense that we see so many versions of dying, trying to avoid death, and navigating whatever comes after death in Middle-earth. While there may not be as many concrete details regarding necromancy as there are for other kinds of magic, death is an important component in some of the most dramatic and often most perilous supernatural moments in the Legendarium. If you enjoyed this video, project your will onto the naked, defenseless soul of the algorithm by hitting the like button. Subscribe to join my host of evil spirits. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, including Bitso Bongo, Dorwin Gray, John Love, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12-String, Louis Maskell, Tamara Saldana, Luke, Karen and Michael Donahue, Kevin Gilstad, Joel Bion, and Rogue Hot Pocket.